The old days when I used to travel, sometimes get on a plane and somebody would say, "Hey, what do you do?" And I say, "Study anthropology." "Oh, what's that?" "Dinosaurs, ants, archaeology." Every so often, though, somebody says, "Culture." "Oh, you study culture." And that's probably because, as a matter of fact, the idea of culture or the concept of culture is anthropology's single most important contribution to popular popular culture, to popular ideas, and to the academy. And so it's a hugely important idea, but it's in some ways difficult because it's such an easy or a simple idea. It's difficult to understand why it's so important without understanding what was happening before anthropologists came up with this notion of culture. And so that's why we did a kind of zippity-doo tour through many, many, many years of human history to get up to about 500 years ago, when you see a whole bunch of all kinds of different political, economic forms all over the world, an enormous complexity of societies, people that have come and gone, rose and fell, were in all different places. And we saw how some of these societies that were kind of on the edges of things, nobody really wanted, if you had grown up in the great cities of Rome, you didn't want to be stationed on the edges of up in what is now Britain and all those places. That would be the barbaric hinterland. So some of these little tiny places like Portugal and Spain become global empires, places that people didn't think anything was going to happen from, setting up, in some cases, in many cases, reinvigorating trade networks like the spice trade and the Silk Road, but definitely creating a new system or a new system of hierarchy. And we saw how, in part because of the infusion of silver from Potosí and the other mines of the New World, and certainly, perhaps even more importantly, the enslavement of Africans to work mostly on sugar plantations in Brazil and in the Caribbean, and setting up a new kind of hierarchy of the world. And eventually, by the time anthropology comes out, the European explanation, or when they look over the rest of the world that they had hierarchized in this way, tended to say, well, that must be because us Europeans are naturally superior. We must be biologically superior, or mentally superior, or have a better environmental situation here, and that's why the world is the way it is. And so anthropologists took this word that already existed in the English language, the idea of culture, but it was mostly applied to things like people who went to museums and appreciated the finer things in life. It was seen as something that the people at the pinnacle of society had, or it was seen as linked to cultivation. We talked about a little bit how it's linked up with the idea of agriculture and being a cultivated person. Anthropologists reimagined this word, or said that this was what everyone had. It's the way in which we became human. And so by doing that, they were eventually speaking against some of these naturalized hierarchies that had been established by European colonialism, by the creation of these kinds of systems in the world. And so the reason culture is so important is not necessarily because of its content in terms of what it is, but what it speaks against. And so culture in some ways is an anti-concept, or it speaks against this explanation that people are the way they are because of their race or their biology or their geography. So that's what we're going to be trying to do in the first part of class, is to talk about the importance of culture, but always in relationship to what was going on beforehand. Now, in understanding culture as an anti-concept and some of these ideas, I'm going to be drawing on the work of Michel-Rolph Trouillot, a Haitian anthropologist and one of my first professors in graduate school, really one of the smartest people I've ever met. He wrote a couple of incredible essays that are still extremely relevant for anthropologists, and I draw on them a lot here. One was called Anthropology and the Savage Slot, and a sort of follow-up to that was called Adieu or Goodbye Culture, A New Duty Arises. We'll be talking about the first essay, or I've been drawing on the first essay in the first part of class, but then talking about some of his ideas in the second part of class about the second essay. So anthropology as an academic discipline really doesn't come out until, around 150 years ago. It's relatively recent in terms of its place in the academy. And so it comes out during the time in which the Northern European empires are starting or have become much more established. We talked about the Portuguese and we talked about the Spanish and how they reshaped the world, but there wasn't anything, people were interested in other people, but there wasn't really an academic discipline of anthropology at that time. So anthropology emerges in what is the Brits and the French and in the United States. And so for the Brits and the French, they'd be studying people that were in either basically in their own empires. So British anthropologists went into parts of Africa and Australia, and French tended to go into parts of Africa as well, and different places in which they were ruling. And for the United States, it really began as a study of peoples who were indigenous to the Americas. Again, but this happens academically relatively late, as we saw in the Wilcox article. A lot of things had already happened in indigenous societies by the time anthropologists show up. Because the US is all over the place now, American anthropology we go all over the world these days. In Trouillot's idea of the savage slot, what he was saying is that the world had been, again, arranged in this hierarchy, and there were disciplines like sociology and economics and political science, to a certain degree history, which basically were studying European societies, studying themselves. And anthropology got everybody else. And so it became the discipline of the non-West, the people outside of the European and American context. And so in sort of crude terms, the central idea is, hey, why are those people like they are? As we talked about, the most common explanations at the time were of biological determinism. They were the way they were because look at them. Let's measure their throats, measure their heads, measure their bodies. Or environmental determinism. So many bananas, so much ice. Depending where you are, that's why you are where you are. And so not only was this an explanation for how people behaved, it was a justification for the hierarchy or the inequalities that existed at the time. Eventually, again, anthropologists were not exactly immune. They were raised in these societies and raised in these ideas, but eventually between biological anthropology, the findings of archaeologists and cultural anthropologists, we say no to these ideas. and that human differences are primarily due to this other thing, learned behavior or culture. So that's the anti-concept part. What it's speaking against, let's try and figure out a little bit. I think perhaps that's more important than what it is. What it is pretty easy to understand. There's two parts. First part, human behavior comes in patterns. That there are regularities to human behavior that you can observe and describe, and at different historical times and periods and in different places, people are going to do different things. Now that's in contrast to the idea that everybody's just kind of doing their own thing, and if you add it all together, it will add up into something. Instead of the idea of it being random, that are, or we might say every individual behavior added up, that there's a structuring process that comes when we grow up in a certain environment and when we interact with our peers that structures our behavior. Those structures or those patterns get reinforced because of the stuff we put into the world, the way we live, our design of our houses, the way we're taught to sit and write and do things with our bodies, so that it becomes a feedback loop where the way we orient ourselves in space and talk to each other helps to reinforce or instantiate, embody these patterns. So one example of this that we can think about that might help is how far apart people stand when they're talking to each other. Now, this changed a little bit. Maybe these days we all have these signs that we have to be 17 feet apart. But in the old days, before we had these signs out, in the United States, people tend to stand about 18 inches apart from each other when they're talking to each other. And if we get closer than that, it feels like you're in my space. Feels like maybe I might need a little more deodorant when I start to back up and get nervous. But if you're too far away, it feels like you're too distant, that you're doing this socially distant thing, that you think I might have the germs or something. So you want to be in between those, about 18 inches apart. In many other societies, for example, in many Latin American societies, it's more like a 14-inch distance. And so people like to be a little bit closer. And if they're too far away, you feel like, well, this person isn't understanding me. So I did my field work in Ecuador and Colombia. And you'd be talking to someone and we'd be doing this little dance because they'd feel like they needed to get a little closer to make themselves understood. And I'd feel like they were getting in my space. And so I'd be backing up and they'd be, and then the next thing you know, we're all the way across the room because we've done this dance. Eventually, I got used to that. And then you come back to the United States and you ask somebody what time it is in the grocery store line and they jump because you're too close to them. Now, nobody taught you this, right? Your mom didn't get out a ruler and say you should be 18 inches away when you're talking to somebody. It's just something that becomes part of our habits, part of our bodily habits. And so without even knowing it, we develop these ideas. It's reinforced by the way we all have these individual desks instead of benches and are taught to sit and have big strollers and big SUVs. And so we're taught we need all this personal, individualized space. And so there's something, you can observe a pattern there. It's not random that this happens. but it's also not entirely brought to our consciousness as well. It's not explicitly taught. The second part of the culture concept is that the patterns that we have are learned. We learn these patterns. Again, not necessarily in school. School is a small part of our learning process. We already come to school speaking language and having all kinds of cultural stuff on board. And in most of human history, didn't have formal education. But we learn these patterns. We grow up with them. We can learn other patterns. It may not become as embodied as the patterns that we have, but it's possible to go to different places and to get very used to the patterns they have and then come back to your original place and have what's called culture shock and reverse culture shock. So we learn these patterns, and that is to say, they aren't determined by the natural world. Now, that's not to say that the natural world has ceased to be important. Biology and human biological difference is still super important, but it doesn't in some ways determine the language you speak, your capacities for being clever. It's not determined by our bodies, and it's not determined by the natural environment. So when we go to places like the Arctic, where the natural environment seems very much limiting, we'll still see a bunch of different ideas, different cultural adaptations to that area. Or places that are in the same latitude and seem to have the same climate can have very, very different ways of organizing their world. Again, not to say it's very important where you grow up. If you grow up close to oceans or you grow up in the mountains or both, that's very important to what kind of society you're going to have, but it's not determining of the kinds of cultural ideas, beliefs. And we can always trade things around with other people as well. So how do we learn these patterns? People come up with these words that are called socialization or inculturation. How we teach people, sometimes without even knowing it as they're growing up. So this can happen from parents to offspring, or from other people who are caring for children, teaching them how to speak in a certain way, dance in a certain way, listen to music in a certain way, make music. It can also happen, of course, with your peers. And in some ways, the way we speak and our interactions start to shift so that our peers become more important even than our parents, and our placement in relationship to our peers becomes patterned as well. Very rare that someone has sat in a different seat in this class. You develop patterns, places you like to sit, but they're in relationship to other people who are in the class. It's not simply random. It depends on what else is going on around you. There's always going to be some thinking about this. So, I mean, the spatial example of being 18 inches apart or 14 inches apart is not something you would think about normally, but we can bring it to consciousness. We can make ourselves aware of it, and we can actually think about it, and we can even try to modify our behavior. So a lot of culture passes under the radar, or under it's so natural to us that we don't realize it. But people are thinking, people are conscious in all societies. In all societies, they're looking around and thinking about the things they're doing. And so always there's going to be symbols involved, interpretations, which help to bring to light what we're doing. One of the ways in which anthropologists think about culture is that it's bound up, or I mean, we like to talk about something we call holism, which basically means that the facets of human life are interconnected. So if we're studying economics and religion, we can study those in two different places, but they're also connected to each other. It's the month of December is also a hugely economically important month because people are going out and buying gifts because of some religious tradition. So these things are always going to be, or anthropologists like to describe them as not separate things, but as interconnected things. Holism also is that the idea that it is actually our learned behavior which was crucial in the transformation of how humans became humans. So if we go back into our biological anthropology, even bipedalism in some ways is a learned behavior, but certainly stone tools and tool making and all those things. So you can't just take off the culture like and then you'd have a pure or a natural human. Again, we like to talk about this idea of we are co-evolving with our tools and implements, and our abilities are evolving together. So going back again into the biological part, you can see how culture is extremely influential in how we change, construct different niches, in effect, perhaps modifying the conditions of selection for the next generation over time, and that everything that we do culturally also can have a biological effect or an implication. That's one of the things we talked about when we're talking about race and racism, is that there's not a validity to the idea that people biologically sort into different groups. It's not a sort of genetic biological reality, but the social reality does have biological consequences for how people grow up and live out their lives, consequences of health, education, who you get to be. From the idea of culture, anthropologists began to talk about this idea of cultural relativism, which basically should be thought of as trying to understand other people's learned behaviors on their own terms, trying to understand how other people have been raised, that their ideas are also embodied and might feel natural to them, and that they may have something to say interesting back to us. So I like to see cultural relativism as primarily against the idea of ethnocentrism, which is that my own way of doing things is the only way that makes sense, and it's the natural way, or it's the way that God intended life to be. That there might be other ways of doing things, and we need to be careful when we make judgments about other people's learned patterns of behavior, because if my patterns have been learned, then their patterns have probably been learned too, and we have to just watch out before we judge others. And so in general, we hope the anthropological perspective on culture should encourage tolerance of other ways of doing things, if not a questioning of our own way of doing things. But I want to be careful here. Cultural relativism is not philosophical relativism. It's not a, well, anything goes because it's culture. That's just their culture. That's the way they do things. Who are we to say that There's all sorts of controversial examples that I could give, but I'll just say that we use cultural relativism as a way of trying to understand what other people are doing. That doesn't mean we're going to never make a judgment about what we or other people are doing. We're simply trying to understand what's going on before we make a judgment. We may very well decide that a certain practice is not worth emulating, and maybe even work to eliminate that practice in our own lives or in the lives of others. So we don't just sit back and say, it's their culture, they're always fighting each other over there, let it be. That doesn't work. That said, as Ruth Benedict pointed out, one of the early anthropologists, the author of the Patterns of Culture, a 1934 book, which really would introduce this term from the early anthropologists, become a worldwide bestseller, introduced the term of culture. Benedict felt that the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. And this is 1934. It's a time when, like at many other times, people's differences were being deliberately questioned. There were lots of ideas about eugenics and being able to breed out bad people and bad traits, and to sort of stomp on people's differences rather than at least try to appreciate them. So this is a statement that a lot of anthropologists would agree with. We haven't always lived up to it, but the idea is here that we help to invite people to be more tolerant of other people's learned behavior. Again, that doesn't mean we approve or have an anything goes attitude, but it's a way of talking back to some of the ideas of racial determinism and the idea that other people had to conform to one standard of life. Anthropologists have tried to talk back to that.